Okay, hello. Right, so our next session is our second plenary for the day by Dr. Kathryn Mannix with the title Listen. Now, Dr. Kathryn Mannix was a consultant in palliative care medicine for 20 years, working in hospices, patients' own homes, and a large teaching hospital. She took early retirement in 2016 to work for better public understanding of dying. This has included radio work, newspaper articles, and a book with the end in mind that became an international bestseller, was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize, and was the Times Thought Book of the Year. Her second book, Listen, about tender communication, was published to critical acclaim in September 2021. Kathryn believes that by naming death, describing the process, and helping people to know what to expect, we can have honest, frank, and helpful conversations that promote better planning of end of life care and reduce unnecessary and unhelpful medical complications of dying. Her hope is that we can demedicalize dying and give it back to everyone as a precious time to be lived as well as possible. Let us welcome Dr. Kathryn Mannix to the stage.
Hello, I'm Kathryn Mannix. Thanks for joining me, or maybe for inviting me to join you, to talk today about those really tender conversations that matter so much to the people either whom we serve as health or social care professionals, or people that we need to try and get alongside in important conversations in our day-to-day lives. And off we go. Those conversations, they're important, aren't they? They're conversations that help us to understand things and to tackle things that can be a little bit daunting. And it's the dauntingness, I guess, that makes them feel slightly trepidatious, because it may very well be that our courage is required. Certainly our skill is required. And we may feel that we're touching on things that are difficult or dangerous or challenging. We know that some of these conversations evoke very hard to hold emotions. And so we start to see courses advertised about courageous conversations or challenging conversations. And I think that perhaps those words mislead us and mislead our behavior in those conversations, because they are words that suggest to us that we need to put our armor on. Whilst all those aspects of a daunting conversation may in fact be true, it's not the fault of the conversation itself, is it? Nor of the people involved in the conversation. So I'd like to turn that attitude on its head. I'd like us all to think about, instead of bringing our armor, bringing our tenderness. If we think about these as tender conversations, it may take us into the conversation in a less defensive way and build bridges and open doors that allow us really to understand the other person's perspective so much better. When I first started thinking about how to write about these tender conversations, originally I thought I'd write about a toolkit. But as I thought about a toolkit, I realized that the analogy doesn't really work very well, because with a toolkit, we pick up one tool, we use it, we put it down, and then we pick up a different tool. In a conversation, that's not quite the way it works, because we're paying attention, we're listening, we're thinking, we're making suggestions, we're asking questions, we're checking things out, and we're doing all of those things in a nuanced and overlapping way. Because a conversation is a partnership. Conversation is something we're doing together. We're working with each other. It's a shared endeavor, isn't it? It's a joint responsibility. And so it seemed to me that perhaps dance was a better analogy, because what we're doing is working together to make the right shapes, to take the right steps, to keep pace with each other, to move backwards and forwards in time, and create between us a space that's the right shape in a dance, a space that's the room for the ideas under discussion in a conversation. And the more I thought about it, the more a dance metaphor seemed a really good way of talking about these really important and tender conversations. So when I've written about tender conversations, I've used these principles to guide the thinking, and I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. But when we think about the dance metaphor, it holds again, because of course, we don't just walk up to somebody and say, you dance. We invite somebody to dance with us, and we dance by mutual agreement. And so invitation into these conversations can be really important. And then the way we listen. Are we listening so that we can speak, or are we listening so that we can understand? And that listening requires curiosity and questions so that we're truly exploring the other person's views, understanding, and difficulties. And it requires us to sit with them when they're distressed without trying to close the distress down or think of ways to fix it, because actually exploring their distress is part of the exploration. A tender conversation might involve quite a lot of silence, and it certainly involves making sure that we're both safe to finish at the end and looking after ourselves so that we can remain well to come back and carry on this work. So let's look at those principles in more detail. First of all, when we think about invitation, that we're not insisting, we're not saying, okay, right now I'm going to tell you, Dad, about what you need to organize so that I'll know what to do if I ever have to act as your power of attorney. That's not a way of inviting somebody into a conversation. It's a request. And it might be a request simply to say, please, may we talk about, or it might be in your professional role that I think we'll have all of the tests back this afternoon and there'll be a time to talk about it. What would be a good time? Who would you like to have there? It might be that we're taking a personal thing to somebody else that we want to talk about. I've had news and I'd like to share it with you. Or it might be that we're simply trying to mull our way through a tricky situation. We're worried about our relationship with our life partner perhaps not being as smooth as we're used to it being. We've noticed that one of our children is a little bit adrift at school and we want to think that through, perhaps with a kind friend or perhaps with a teacher. So these are conversations for life. They're not just clinical conversations for us professionally. But the thing that's important about the invitation is that it's by mutual consent. So we need to find a time that works with the right people present for both of us. So that works when we're offering the invitation, but it also works when somebody says, oh, I really need to talk to you about, and actually you don't have time now to give whatever that thing is, the time and attention it deserves. To acknowledge that that's really important. I'd really like to find time for that too, but actually right now I'm in a hurry and I haven't got the time that it needs. So let's find a time, let's give it the value that it deserves by identifying when and how we'll meet each other to talk about this important thing. And then once we start, the key to our understanding isn't what we say, it's actually about what we hear, how we listen. And that's why, having written about these important conversations, the book is called Listen. Let's think a bit about listening to understand. We need to forget about what we're going to say. We're perhaps used to being in meetings where we're there to say something very particular, and perhaps we hear somebody saying something that is at odds with what we want to say, and now we stop listening to the meeting because we're just waiting for the point where we can slot in what we need to say so that our side gets heard too. That's listening to speak. Listening to understand is about understanding the other person's perspective. And to do that, we actually can't respond. We don't know what we're going to say until we've really listened, we've reflected on what the person said, and we've checked that we've understood what they've said. Turns out I've been using a dance metaphor for a very, very long time. I've been teaching communication skills to clinicians and particularly to doctors and medical students for a long time. And I often advocate them using a question summary waltz. So having asked one question, the next question expands what we heard the person say. And then the third thing we do is make a statement, a summary, a check that we're still hearing correctly. And we're not gradually, through our own assumptions, drifting away from the person's truth as we're trying to understand them. So I really advocate that you try this question, question, summary, waltz. You almost certainly won't give a summary for every 2 questions. But if you leave the summary till the very end, you may find you've already drifted a long, long way. So question, question, summary, waltz is something to really bear in mind and think about as you listen to understand what a person is saying. What we're trying to do really is just be curious, to explore what's going on for this person in this situation. And children are our role models here because curiosity just allows all possibilities. Children are curious about everything. There aren't right or wrong answers. They ask us a question, we tell them the answer. They may be wide-eyed with the wonder of that amazing thing we've just said, but immediately another question comes back about that. So when we're being curious, rather than saying to somebody, oh, yes, I know exactly how you feel, when they start to tell us their dilemma or their difficulty or their situation, we ask more about it. We explore it using questions and invitations like, I'd really like to know more about that. That sounds difficult for you, or that sounds interesting, or I don't know very much about that. Tell me more about that. What we're really trying to find out is, what was it like for you? And we know that people who've been sick for a long time get very tired of telling the same story about their illness over and over. And they ask us, don't you have records? Isn't this written down somewhere? Why do I have to keep telling you this? But actually, a really, really important part of taking a history that often is overlooked is not what were the events you experienced, but what was it like to be you experiencing those events? What was it like when you woke up from that really important operation? What was it like for you as you were going through that treatment? How was it as you were explaining to your family that things were not going so well? So taking a history, not by asking about the events, but by asking about their experience. A really important thing is happening here. As this person is telling us the story about their experience, about their concerns, about their hopes and ideas for the future, there are 2 listeners. We're listening, obviously, but they are listening too. And you'll all have had that experience of, you wake up in the middle of the night and there's a thing on your mind. It's got so many components that are all floating around. You can't get hold of any of them. It's so difficult. It feels like you can't solve it. And in the daytime, it may feel a little bit less difficult, but it's still got so many moving parts. It's difficult to know where to start. But when somebody gives us the time and the space to tell the story, what happens is we can only tell the story 1 sentence at a time. And so we notice, as people are telling us their story, this thing happens. As they tell the story, they're gradually making sense of it. They're gradually putting it into sequence. They'll often say something and then say, oh no, hang on, that didn't happen then. That happened before this other thing I've already told you about. And we watch them assembling the story, listening to the story, making sense of it for themselves as well. And that's a really important function of allowing people to tell us their story. There's research that shows that on average, when a person goes to their general practitioner to ask for advice, they start to tell their story and they're interrupted on average at 18 seconds. There's also research that shows that when our time is very limited, allowing the person to speak without interruption for a golden minute actually gives us more information in a shorter amount of time than we would get by diving in and asking questions from the very beginning. So holding the space and remaining curious allows the person to tell the story and allows both of us to hear it clearly. We'll be using questions to help us to reach a fuller picture. And I want to say a little bit about questions and what we ask about and how we hold ourselves back from moving too quickly into solutions. So 2 different sorts of questions. The first sort of questions are exploring what's currently going on. And these are the sort of questions that help us to probe for the bits that the person may not have told us when we gave them time and were simply curious about their experience. It may be that they've told us all of their thoughts, but none of their emotions. It may be they've told us all of their physical sensations, but none of the behaviors that are going on. So some of you will recognize that thinking, behaving, emotions, and physical sensations is part of the makeup of cognitive behavior therapy. And that's from my cognitive therapist background. And it's also written about a bit in the book. But it helps us to notice what the person's saying and also what they're omitting, so we can ask additional questions about the things they haven't talked so much about. We can also ask them questions that help them to think about what they've said so far and bring it all together. Those are called synthesizing questions. So a synthesizing question might be something like, now you've told me all of that and helped me to understand it a little bit better from your perspective. What do you make of it all, now that you've said it all again? Also asking for things that might be missing. Literally up front, could we be missing anything here? Is there anything being overlooked? Are there any things that perhaps are relevant to this but you haven't talked about yet? And also thinking about, is this actually the way you're seeing it? Or could a different person make a different interpretation of the same things you've described? Could there be a different way of looking at this or interpreting this? And these are all ways of making sure that we've really thoroughly explored the current situation before we leap to our comfort zone. Because we who are health and social care professionals, we're helpers. That is our comfort zone. We like to make things better. We like to move things forward. We like to find a way to solve things. And sometimes that's our downfall, because we try to solve before we've really understood the situation. So having really understood the situation, we can move into using questions about possible ways forward. And I'd like us to just stop for a moment and think about this. When we start to make suggestions to people about how they might solve a problem, we usually are reaching for a thing that's simple. And yet we're dealing with an intelligent person who feels stuck. If the solution that we can think of right now, having just heard their story, was a good fit and it was as easy as that, they'd have thought of it. They'd have done that by now. So let's not reach for giving advice. Let's instead continue to ask questions, and now ask questions about, what have they already tried? Have they tried things that didn't work at all? Have they tried things that worked a bit but not as well as they'd hoped? Have they tried things that actually made things worse? Are there any aspects of this situation that are simple enough that they could easily be changed, even if the big stuff hasn't been changed? What would happen if we changed something smaller, if we went for an easy win, if you like? How might that make the rest of the situation feel? What life experience of solving difficult things does this person already have? How can they use that experience? How can you use your experience of difficulties in your health in the past, or working with people who've had difficulties of their own, to help you to think of a way that you might try to tackle this current problem? And this $2 million question. If a friend told you this story, if a friend was in the situation that you're in right now, what advice would you give a friend? And it's astonishing how often people can give great advice to a friend and yet be completely stuck for what they would do for themselves. As we listen to the story, we will elicit the person's distress. And this now really challenges us, because we will feel our need to fix bubbling up within us. We want to make it better. We want to stop the person's suffering. We want to stop their distress. And we do things like offering reassurance. Oh, it's not going to be as bad as that. I'm sure there's going to be a way we're going to be able to solve this. People who tell us that they're worried about pain, and we tell them, oh, we have great painkillers these days, when actually their worry is about what the pain will do to them. And we've closed the situation down for exploration immediately by giving reassurance instead of listening. It is hard for us who are helpers, but what we need to do is allow the distress, and be quietly present with it while they process it. So we're saying things that don't interfere with their thinking and their processing, but say it's okay for me to be here with you while you process this. Things like, I'm really sorry, this is so hard. Or I'm still here. I'm just going to be here. You take your time. One of the things that's happened during COVID, of course, is that we're not even having some of these conversations face to face. It's down the phone, and we may need to say things so the person knows that we are still present. We might need to say that we're not in a hurry, even when often we feel we're in a tearing hurry, because by giving time now, we're enabling this situation to reach a more helpful point before we leave the conversation, ready to pick up next time. There is lots of silence in a tender conversation. There's silence because when we ask a question and listen to the answer, we need to reflect on the answer before we know what we're going to say next. This isn't like working through a checklist like a pain assessment where every question is the same question as usual, no matter what the person has told us about their pain. This isn't checklist questioning. This is reflective questioning. And so it builds in silence, and silence slows the conversation down and gives people space to think. And it's in that silence that the work really happens. So we need to stay out of the way. We need to be quiet, but we need to remain present. So things to think about. If we're gazing at the person expectantly, they may feel that we're in a hurry and that we want them to say the next thing. So think about gazing downwards to show them that you're with them, but you're offering them space. It might be that a calming touch at the back of somebody's hand or on their shoulder helps them to feel that you're being empathic whilst they're struggling with deep emotions. Sometimes there are moments of shared humour, aren't there? Although we do need to be really careful with that. It might be that what we're going to do is offer a cup of tea. We're going to hand them tissues if they're starting to cry. And we're going to sit on our inclination to fill the silence with explanations, with excuses, with details of the treatments we've tried, the things that we're wanting to do in the future. No, just be quiet. Just be present. Just be their companion in their distress. Silence is where the work is happening. It's where people make their minds up. It's where people notice discrepancies. It's where people change their minds. Silence is important. It shouldn't feel awkward. We shouldn't be thinking of silence as a difficulty. We should be thinking of silence as part of the work. And then towards the end, we need to be sure that we are both ready to leave without leaving this person kind of emotionally naked from their examination of what they've been going through with us. So it's helpful if we identify what time's available from the very beginning. And it can also be really helpful to share the timekeeping. I used to really struggle with timekeeping in my cognitive therapy sessions, which is a therapy hour, which is 45 to 50 minutes with the person, and then 10 minutes for reflection, writing the notes and restoring the therapist before the next encounter starts with a new patient. And I took that to supervision, and all the other cognitive therapists said, well, don't you share the timekeeping? Well, what a really useful, sensible, obvious suggestion. So now I say to people, what time do you need to finish? Okay, that's good. That works for me too. In fact, I need to finish by whatever time. Let's keep an eye on the clock together. Do you have a watch? There's a clock there I might need to look at from time to time, or there's no clock in here. So you'll see me looking at my watch. It's not to be rude. It's to make sure that we've still got enough time left. And then depending on the length of the appointment, so in a half-hour appointment, we might give a 10-minute warning. In a GP 10-minute appointment, we might give a 2-minute warning to allow time to gather our wits, gather our senses, gather ourselves and prepare to end the session. And remember, we don't have to finish the work in one conversation. We can come back and have another conversation. So towards the end, to check that we're both okay, to be appreciative that the person has shared so deeply with us, and then orientate them up and out of the session by talking about their next steps. Who else do they need to talk to? What other information do they need to gather? What are their next steps going to be? Where are they going to next? Who will they speak to next? How will they get where they're going? Bringing them back to reality so they've put their emotional coat back on before they go back out into the world. And also, of course, if there's more to talk about, when will we next meet each other? So having finished safely for the person we're supporting, we need to think about looking after ourselves as well, because we are the instruments of the workforce. Our scanners and x-ray machines and endoscopes, they all get looked after. They get downtime, they get maintenance. We are the most precious component of what's offered by our organisation, because we are offering the care and the kindness, and we need maintenance and self-care too. So sometimes we can't take things on. Sometimes we do have to say no. Now, clearly it's unlikely that we'll just say no, but perhaps we have to say that we have a regret that we can't take it on. I'd really like to do it, but I can't do it right now. Or although I can't take this on at the moment, I know somebody who might be helpful. Or yes, my lovely boss, I could take on that project, but I need you to tell me what I can put down from my current portfolio to take this on for you, because I'm actually technically completely full. No is a complete sentence. It can sound a little bit abrupt. You may have to repeat it because people aren't used to us saying no, but it is a really important part of looking after ourselves, because we're so busy valuing everybody else, but we need to look after ourselves too. And you all know about self-care, but why not just ask yourself how good you are at looking after yourself as much as all the other people that you look after? During the COVID pandemic, during the first wave, I went back into NHS work in my big local trust, and I was part of the staff support services there. And here are some of the things that staff talked to me about what they were doing to look after themselves after they had had a tender conversation which they felt had left them emotionally depleted. So a lot of people were using mindfulness. In fact, one of the mindfulness apps has made itself free to download for NHS staff. So you could look that up and that might be helpful for you. So to take a 5-minute check-in or a 10-minute check-in, to just be present in the moment, using an app or following your breathing or looking mindfully out of a window, whatever it is. Some people fancied a beverage instead, and I can stretch a cup of tea into a really mindful episode of 10 minutes of brewing and then savouring that cuppa. A lot of people just wanted to see nature, see the sky, see outside. Some of them could go outside. Some of them had to do that by looking at photographs on their phones. Mobile phones became really important. People were able to listen to music on them, phone a friend, use a mindfulness app. And some people just needed to let their emotions out, either on their own or perhaps with a colleague, to cry, to rage, to think about what they just said and how they felt about it. But all of them were using that time to recenter themselves so that they were able to go back into the workspace. But we also need to look after ourselves in between times, don't we? So thinking about taking the time to reflect, whether that's with a person, with a supervisor, or whether we do it in writing down how we felt at the end of a particular interaction, or journaling. Valuing our supervision. So if it's one-to-one supervision, and some people are lucky enough to have that, to go to supervision prepared with the thing that we want to talk about in mind, with a supervision question or a supervision topic specifically to discuss. Some of us have group supervision, and group supervision is incredibly important, and the same rules about tender listening apply. When I arrive in my supervision group with the rest of my team, we need everybody to arrive on time. We need to respect our supervisor's time. When I tell my team that I'm worried about this particular conversation that I had with a family that I felt somehow didn't go as well as I had hoped, I need them to listen to me. I don't need them to say, oh no, don't worry about it. We saw that family later, they were fine. Oh, they loved you. That's exactly the kind of fixing and reassurance that we're talking about not doing with patients and clients and our extended family and friendship groups, we need to not do that to each other as well. If one of our supervision group is concerned about an interaction, our task as a group is to help them to explore the concern, not close the concern down. So taking supervision really seriously, seeing it as our maintenance time being provided by our organisation, and if we're not being provided with supervision by our organisation, to actually talk to them about the importance of that, because it is their duty of care to us to keep us well. And then outside of work, to make sure that somehow in all the busyness, we do find some relaxation time as well. So as we come to an end, I wonder really what you think and feel about the idea of being tender in your conversations. What do you think it would feel like to listen without judging or reassuring or trying to fix things? And I'm going to give you 2 minutes now. I'm going to time it when I'm going to be relatively silent. I'm going to model the model while you think about 2 things that you'll do differently in your important conversations over the next week or 2. And I'd like you to think of 2 things. I'd like you to write them down, and I'd like you to really commit to them. 2 minutes, starting now. 2 things that you will try out. Things that you'll do differently from your normal practice. And it's an experiment. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's about your curiosity of wondering what would happen if, instead of reassuring and giving information, I simply remained curious and asked more questions. What would happen if I allowed more silence and said less? 2 things that you could try out. That's your first minute. 1 more minute to think of 2 things that you're going to try. Things that are different from your usual behaviour during these important conversations. Thinking of 2 things and then writing them down so you've made a commitment. You might be able to think of a particular conversation that lies ahead for you, that you'll use one or both of these things. You might want to talk to a colleague about your commitment. You might want to talk to them afterwards about what you did. Thank you for joining in by thinking about what you do. That's your 2 minutes done. Some of you will know I've written about this more extensively, and the book, Listen, How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations, is available now in hardback and in paperback, and I hope that it will be in your local library. It's in a lot of hospital libraries, hospice libraries. I hope it's going to be useful to you. Thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Kathryn, that was absolutely fantastic. This, listening is actually our most important skill as palliative care practitioners, and amazingly, I think you've actually listened to us too, despite us not talking. That's how I felt. Like I was close to crying, and I'm sure everybody felt the same. It was so heartfelt. I've read your first book, fell in love with it, and I need to get your second book, Listen. Thank you so much for that. Now, before we receive any questions, which even you've answered one from the floor, we'll first continue with your next topic on cognitive first aid. We'll go to the next session for this.